Thanks so much to all my patrons. Join now to help support the channel and help pick the books that I review. Link in the description.
And I am done. Okay, so I just got done reading Wind and Truth. This is the 5th book of Stormlight Archive by Brandon Sanderson, and I want to give you my unedited thoughts on finishing this book, which is literally just right now. So, yeah, not a fan. Not a fan. I'm going to give this one 2 stars, and I feel, God, that sucks that I have to give it 2 stars, but it doesn't deserve anything more than that, at least for me. That was disappointing. And that's perhaps the most disappointing book that I've ever read in my life. And because, like, how was it this bad? Like, what happened? This is shocking. I honestly don't recognize this book as a Stormlight book in terms of the quality. It's just, what happened to Sanderson as a writer? Because this isn't one of those cases where it's like, oh, Matt, you've probably read a ton of fantasy books since you read those the first time. They're all like this. You've just kind of changed as a reader over time, and these books aren't really made for you anymore. Well, that's not really true, because I just reread all the books, and I liked to loved them all. And that was very, like, over the past 4 or 5 months, I've reread all the 4 books preceding this. So that certainly wasn't the problem. The problem was that the plot was a mess, to say it kindly. The plot was a mess. The dialogue was noticeably worse than previous books, and it was already not good. I mean, it was like passable, and it's beyond that at this point. The pacing problems, we'll talk about it, but it was atrocious from a pacing perspective. I felt like the editing or lack thereof of this book was extremely apparent. And ultimately, I mean, Stormlight is made to be created into 2 5-book arcs. And, I've had so much faith that Sanderson, I misplaced this, because I felt like, Mistborn Era 1, ended with such a nice, everything coming together, and all of those little jigsaws that Sanderson has created over time. His, strong suit is plotting things out and planning things out so that everything kind of fits together in such a satisfying way in the end. I was confident that would happen again, but anything but. And if you would have told me that Sanderson had planned this out, and this was the way that he wanted to do it, he didn't get shoehorned in like George R. R. Martin did with Song of Ice and Fire. This was his idea and goal from the start. I would have thought that was nuts, because there were so many problems here, and this arc went out with a whimper, and the ending was a huge whiff and massively, massively underwhelming. So before we go into depth on things, let's go over the things that I actually liked about this book, because there are things, and if I didn't like anything, I certainly wouldn't have. I would have just given it 1 star. But I still love this world. I love the world. I feel like the lore of this world and created a beautiful history it's very innovative. Not the fact that there's lore, but the lore itself, I feel like is well thought out, well planned, and it intrigues me. So to write all of these events happening in this pivotal moment in this world's history, and we get this deep, rich history of this world and the intricately put together world itself. I mean, so many different magical systems coming together, and the way that, even that the planet is terraformed, and, and the way these different peoples come together, and the history between them, and the politics, and it's very richly done. And, because I didn't like this book doesn't take away from what was built there, and the fact that I still get some passing, enjoyment out of these stories that are done in this book, but it's left with this huge sense of there should have been so much more, there could have been so much more, and everything that was attempted had a hint of this could have been good, but it's not. There are some good things to pick out from this, but ultimately it failed, and So yeah, I also feel like I'm not joking, but I really do love the artwork in this book. I feel like putting the heralds and using them throughout these, putting multiple heralds per book, and it helps visualize them. I think it's very well done. The whole package put together, very well done. I thought that with the epigraphs that are put before the chapters were intriguing. And I realize that the compliments I'm giving are very narrow, But ultimately, I'm stretching just to find those. These are the reasons that this book was not 1 star. So let's go into the real reasons that I really didn't like this book, and the reason you're probably watching this video right now. So let's talk about the length. Now, this book is over 1,300 pages long, and I don't have a problem with long books. I mean, this year I read a book that was over 2,000 pages, and it felt shorter than this book. The problem was that feeling sense that I just went over. This book feels not 1,300 pages. This book feels like 5,000 pages. It is a grind to get through this thing. It feels like the worst of Wheel of Time in many ways, in terms of like how slow things were coming out, and you just had to pull them out. And it's as if somebody told Brandon, and I'm not being snarky here and saying that I actually believe this, because I don't, but it just comes off like somebody said, Sanderson, I know you just wrote an 800-page story. It's good. But we're going to need this 800-page story to be like 1,400 pages. And I know that we're not going to like let you put in more material here or more scenes. Just stretch all of them out really, really, really long. Because I really feel like you could have cut out, like 500 pages from this thing. Easily cut out 500 pages from this. Probably more. And you wouldn't have lost anything. In fact, the book would have improved. Make a bonus cut for people that really want everything and you need to get everything. But there's no reason that this needed to be this long. It didn't make sense. It's going to throw off people. And, just hearing people's thoughts about this book as I'm, talking about them, I'm not like an isolated case here. People that felt like, this is way, way too long of a book for the amount of the slow pacing that went on here. So speaking of pacing, let's talk about it. There's a couple problems I had with the pacing here. And the one of them, and I know this is something that probably a lot of people enjoy, but the 10-day structure to this story was a bizarre choice. The structure that we've had in the past is to separate each book into arcs. And there's 3, 4, 5 arcs per book. And there's no set time period that each arc takes place in. It's just a natural, after a major event that feels like a pivotal moment in the story, an arc will end. We'll go to get a few interlude chapters of characters that are not integral to the story. And then we'll come back and kind of restart again. Maybe get some different POV characters that are going to be told in this next story. It's a really nice flow to things. This one felt shoehorned in. The 10-day structure made it so that every day had to end an arc, and then we had to go to these interlude stories way more often. And so what we got was not like this really fun interlude system that we got in the past, where mostly you get interludes that are just kind of vanilla, getting some flavoring around vanilla, just getting some flavor out of the world and just taking it in. And every now and then you get kind of an important one. But in this one, it was like every one of them was kind of important. And the way that each arc ended, each of these days ended, was not in some major, huge moment. It was just like the day ended and now we're going to have to end this. There were some interesting things that they ended on, or, Brandon tried to make them, these big pivotal moments, but they just weren't there. So I had a problem with that. My other problem with the pacing, and I'd have to go back and really pay attention to the previous books, but it felt like Brandon was, to a hyper degree, focused on jumping the action between characters. In the past, what he would do was this move where he would give a chapter, and then the following chapter would almost never be from that same character. And then we'd have to wait a few chapters to go back to the events from that one character. And I don't love that. I like, if I had to choose, I'd go the Robert Jordan kind of style, where they would tell a character and do 10 plus chapters of that character, tell a beginning, middle, and end to an important story of them, and then move on to somebody else. And we're not going to get to them for maybe even a book or two, but you don't get that frantic jumping around thing. But this is what Stormlight is. We're going to deal with it. But he then integrated this thing where every chapter had multiple POV people, and it would jump in multiple times within that. The amount of time that you spent with each character was a fraction of what it used to be. And what it did was it took away from those big, huge, fun, explosive moments that Stormlight is known for. One of the biggest moments I think in Stormlight history is the Honor is Dead scene from the second book. And if that scene was in this book, here's what would have happened. Kaladin would have said, Honor is dead, but I'll see what I can do. And then it would have just jumped to another character in a different part of the world, and we wouldn't have ended up seeing what Kaladin then did from that point. And it would have given you this weird sense of delayed satisfaction, like intensely delayed, where you'd be at the edge of your seat, ready to jump up and cheer and enjoy what you're about to read, and then be like, boom, now we're going to see what Jasmine's up to, over here doing this scribe work over here. It's like, what? How is that in any way enjoyable? And, I get that Sanderson does this quick cuts at the end of his stories because we're in the finale. It's got that everything's building to this, and then we're just, cut, and like it builds to this crescendo. But when you're doing that from like page 1, it takes away from that. Not only does it take away from that at the end, but it makes it not interesting going throughout, because there's so many arcs here that I didn't enjoy. So to go from an arc that I'm actually getting into and then something big and fun happens, then to have to go to somebody that I'm not enjoying anymore, that just cuts all enjoyment out of the story and ruins these big moments that Sanderson is trying to achieve. So yeah. Pacing, what's going on? The writing. The writing is somehow more casual. The writing is somehow more pedestrian from an author that already writes way too casually and way too pedestrian. And like I said earlier, he's at the writing quality that I'm at. It's my, pretty close to my limit of saying, like, I'm going to, knock some scores off from this author if they start writing anything worse from this. And he wrote way worse than that. I mean, he's got the cringiest scenes in here. The dialogue is so pathetic. He's got these lame, like dick jokes that are, not funny in the slightest. Sanderson is not a funny person. And it seems like what's happening here, not only in the humor department, but in the length of the book that we discussed earlier. And I wouldn't be surprised if this was another like George Lucas situation, where he's gotten so big and larger than life and like dominates an entire genre that nobody will tell him an opposing point of view. I assure you that people behind the scenes and all his beta readers and people are saying, like, Sanderson, your humor is just spot on. But you cannot tell me that the vast majority of readers that read this kind of thing are doing anything other than going like, yeah, this might have been funny when I was like 10. But these books aren't written for 10-year-olds. And so I don't understand why he's still addicted to this, other than he's just getting fed this false information constantly. Otherwise, I don't get it. I just don't get it. He's being way more casual with his writing. The way that they're dropping current terms current medical terms, and like, it doesn't make sense. It feels like it needed editing. It needed massive editing. And I don't understand what happened. Like, I heard somebody tell me that like he changed editors from the previous books, maybe for the previous two books, like the book before this and this one, or maybe just this one. But there is something different, and that's got to be it, right? Like, what else can it be? But he also said, like, I did more revisions in this story than I've ever done before. What did it look like before? I think that's the initial question we have to ask. Was this like a 3,000 page like rambling? Like, what went on in these multiple edits? Like, I would love to see the beginning and the end of that and go through that process. But all right, let's talk about the plot. And for now, until the end of this review, I'm going to have to jump into spoilers mode because I got to get this off my chest. I'm finally able to talk about this with people. And you know what? It's my channel. I can talk spoilers if I want. So let's go into some random problems with the plot that I had. So let's talk about the Contest of Champions. It was incredibly underwhelming. We spent, I don't know what, 5,000, 6,000 pages leading up to this moment. And at least at the end of last book, we're promised this moment. We're promised it's going to happen in 10 days. We have to suffer through this annoying 10-day structure just to know that nothing is going to happen in those 10 days till finally we get to this 10th day and finally things start to go down. And then to get Gavilar as the champion, what? Like, that could be interesting on paper. And you're like, oh, that'd be interesting. But then you think about it for a second and you're like, yeah, but that would suck. But that second thing never happened. It just failed miserably. It was like trying to pull on Dalinar's heartstrings and tie in this arc of him learning how to like save family members over time. But like, it didn't even feel like Dalinar anymore. And it felt like we were promised this cool, awesome, epic fight. And we got not even like a fight of wits. We got a moral quandary that it was not much of a moral quandary. Do you want to save, millions of people, or do you want to save one? And obviously, somebody like Dalinar would have made a different choice than they made. And the fact that Sanderson's trying to tell us that he didn't is odd. Or maybe he is so genius and he thought of something even way beyond that. And next level thinking isn't even Dalinar either. But yeah, just massively underwhelming. Moash, where art thou, Moash? What happened to you? Moash is turned into like this general on the singer side. And not the singers, but you know what I'm talking about. And now he's just random, cameos, just jumping around, little cutscenes of Moash every now and then. But like nothing, like that plot just, like what was the point of the Moash plot? There's so much that's gone into this, then to just kind of like fizzle him out over time. What? Like, what? I don't get it. I don't get it. The spiritual realm, that was a mess. Now, I get I'm a little biased. I don't love spiritual, random, dream-like sequences, and we got hundreds of pages of that. But this was essentially hundreds of pages of info dumping that I felt like should have naturally come out in the previous books, but instead they just happened all at once, and it's just like, what? Why? Why do we need all of this info? And ultimately it feels like, what the big difference, and there's a lot of differences, but like the big difference between some of my favorite authors, people like Steven Erikson, people like R. Scott Baker, and the way that they tell their epic fantasy stories, because they trust the reader to not have every single little thing spelled out to them. Now, I know that in my two examples here, they do that to an extreme degree, right? But there is a middle ground here that I feel like a vast majority of people would appreciate. But just to like hammer on things so like the dumbest of dumb people couldn't possibly miss it. It just dumbs things down and ruins it for the vast majority of people. And so to have to explain every little thing, and like there's these revelations that come out that it's like any reasonable thinker would have been like, yeah, I know, I already kind of came to that conclusion, but now you're going to have this person tell it and then this person tell it again, and just everyone come together and try to really make sure the reader didn't miss that important thing. It was painful. Also, no Talon fight? Why no Talon fight? Talon is brought up from the beginning of this story to become the most powerful, awesomest fighter in history. In this book alone, it is just dumped on heavy thick that this, we're going to finally see some actual fighting capabilities out of like the world's greatest fighter, and then just nothing. Come on. Let's talk about the Kaladin storyline, because what was the Kaladin storyline? The mental health scenes from Kaladin were really bad. Now, essentially, Kaladin turns into a therapist in this story. He turns into a therapist with no training and decides he's going to create this field of mental health therapy for PTSD, which is not an easy form of mental health therapy. I am married to a mental health therapist. That we're talking about years and years and years of therapy with these people to try to make some progress. And Kaladin, in a week of working with somebody, or 10 days, is able to just like have a major breakthrough and totally fix the way somebody thinks. Multiple people in the way that they think. And Kaladin just like coming up with these mental health terms. It's like Sanderson read the DSM, or realized it existed and went like, I need to like put all this stuff in here. I need to like show that I know what I'm talking about. But he missed the part where therapy takes time and it's not a rushed thing. And it made it seem so silly. And so like the mental health stuff I thought was really bad, and like crazily taking away all the interesting things that Kaladin had going for him. And just like neuter this character. But then I already talked about how boring it was to have these 10 fights, or 10 fights. Is it 10 fights they had? Maybe 10 fights. But like you knew that they didn't matter until the ending of these fights. And so like what was the point of these disappointing things? One or two of them was like mildly interesting, but eventually it's like I want to get to the end. And then you get to the end and there's another mental health quandary. And we got to solve somebody's mental health crisis, not with 10 days of traveling with them, but in a less than 1 day time period. We're going to go ahead and solve somebody's mental health crisis. Somebody's mental health crisis, mind you, that they've been suffering for thousands and thousands of years. What? I don't understand. It doesn't make sense. I don't get that. what else? What other arcs do we have here? We had the Adolin arc, in the Shattered Plains, and honestly, now I'm going to seem contradictory here, but it felt like this arc needed more pages because it's like it felt very rushed, and there wasn't enough like to it, and everything in that arc was from the perspective of like Adolin, and I needed more from this. I needed to, or just don't include it because ultimately it didn't really matter. Most of this book didn't matter in the end. It all came down to what Dalinar did at the end. So you know that was boring. You know, speaking of also something that felt like it failed to deliver in a long build-up was this Ba-Ado Mishram. I'm probably butchering how to say this, but it's this unmade who is built up to be so like world-endingly evil and bad and would do horrible things if unleashed on the earth. And there's so much built into then finally doing this, and then it's done in nothing. Why would that? Why was the Ba-Ado Mishram stuff in the story? Did you just? I don't get it. And speaking of why are they in the story, why was the Jasnah arc in the story? Like, what did this arc tell us? And did we need it? Was it just because Brandon was like, I have to, I can't build up Jasnah and then not tell what happens with Jasnah, but then to get that is the Jasnah arc? Like, what? Some of her discussions with Odium were somewhat interesting, or whatever he calls himself now, and it's just like I hated it. And like Odium, this is nitpicky, but like the fact that he saved his family still and like saved all his people in the end of this story goes against everything that makes like Odium. And I loved like the initial take of it that he was willing to do this thing, this cool, really fun thing that's been used in literature before. But nonetheless, it's always shocking and surprising and interesting. But then like, I didn't actually do it. It's like, ugh. So yeah, I didn't like this book. I'm very hesitant going into the next arc of Stormlight. I will obviously read it because I still enjoy this series. It's just like, maybe there was a blip. Maybe something wrong happened here and we're going to reset things in a positive way. But, that was rough. And, yeah, my hope for the series has plummeted. And I'm hope for good things in the future. So that is it for me. Thank you so much for watching this very depressing review. And as always, happy reading to you.
Thanks again to all my patrons, with a special shout out to my Ascendant tier and Librarian tier patrons: Amy, Alex P, Anna G, Doused, Darren, JD, Jerry, Jonathan, Josh, Nathan T, Nev's Book Channel, 𝐿𝐴𝐴, Ron Reich, Russell, Ryan L, Sydney Baker, Slay, Tahir, Wyatt, Anna, Alfredo, Blair, Bevan, Eric Cannon, Joe UK, Kat Mick, Marcus, Michael Sugarman, and Sky. Thanks for sticking to the end of this video, and if you want to watch some more content from my channel, click over here and I've got some good videos for you. Thanks so much.